I'm going to kind of go through this, provide sort of an overview of what I'm talking about. What is road vehicle automation, some of the potential benefits, but then I'm going to go right into some sort of recent legislative developments and talk about some of the regulatory issues, and then maybe, just maybe, propose what at least a current model for state legislation ought to look like. So, what is road vehicle automation? So we're talking about broadly intervening advanced driver assistance systems. Automated technology, we've had it for a number of years, but at these lower levels, and I'll get to these National Highway Traffic Safety Administration levels in just a moment. But you know, we've seen things including adaptive cruise control, which Randall is a huge fan of. You know, most recently, you've probably heard in the news with Tesla's autopilot that they've rolled out to the Model S. Now, I think it's all well and great that Tesla's doing this, but you know what we're really seeing with Tesla is at maybe a higher functioning level 2 automation level. But really, what I think is the coolest about what Tesla's doing is how they're doing it, which is pushing firmware updates through a wireless update, which I think that's you know, in the future when we have automated systems deployed, this is how we're going to have to update them. So that's what I think is most important with Tesla. But you know, so when I say automated vehicles, I'm using Bryant Walker Smith's definition. So we're talking about computer direction of a vehicle steering, braking, and accelerating without real-time human input. So in this context, self-driving vehicle, we talk about driverless cars, which is somewhat imprecise, but we're talking about these highly automated vehicles or perhaps fully automated vehicles which can direct these core driving functions, and these correspond to NHTSA levels 3 and 4.
Mark, can you be somewhere between?
This, better?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm sure you're going to block somebody.
I'm blocking. I don't think I can. I don't think I can win. And
if you go to the left of the screen, back up and go on my left, your right.
I need to be able to hit the space bar on this, so I'm boxed in a little bit. I can maybe crouch, but then
Or sit on a chair.
Why don't you just sit down?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
Watch your chords.
Whoa.
You're lazy.
Yeah, exactly. This is more like fireside chat.
Right.
So yeah, we've got that up there. So let's just quickly go through these NHTSA automation levels. Level 0, pretty obvious. That's no automation. These are your traditional motor vehicles where we have to drive ourselves. I know, it's terrible. Level 1, we're talking function-specific automation. So this is where you have a single function. You know, so you could have adaptive cruise control as an example of this, but you know, you have an independent automated primary control function that's automated. You could have more than one level 1 function on the vehicle, and the vehicle is still considered level 1. When we go to level 2, this is when you have level 1 functions that work in unison. So you're talking about some of these self-parking features would qualify as level 2, and level 2 on the higher end would be something like Tesla Autopilot. Level 3, this and the photo is of Google's initial prototype when they outfitted these Toyota Priuses and some of these Lexus vehicles with sensor technology and software that was capable of directing these core driving functions without real-time human input. However, there was still a way for the driver, the operator, to retake manual control after some sort of a transition period. And level 4, this is where everyone wants to go. This is the self-driving car. This is where, and I've got Google's latest prototype, this low-speed vehicle pod car, which is, you know, you step in the car and you hit a button or you enter your destination and it just takes you there. You have no ability responsibility to retake manual control at any point. Some of the potential benefits, you know, reduced accidents. I think human beings are pretty good drivers, all things considered, but we're not that great. So we have human error being a factor, some factor, in approximately 93 to 94% of crashes. Reduced congestion, suboptimal merging maneuvers, for instance, are one of the largest drivers of recurring road congestion. So when you take out when you take out crashes and things like that. We're just looking at congestion driven by driver behavior. This is, one of the benefits you see is reduced congestion, and this is really maximized when you do platooning. So you place these cars very close together, move them at high speeds down the highway. Improved air quality as a result of reduced congestion. We do have a parabolic relationship between speed and emissions. So if we're able to keep congestion mitigated or better mitigated with this technology, you're also going to see local air quality improvements. And then improved individual mobility. This is what the disabled community has recently kind of coalesced around the self-driving car, because they see, right now where you have disabled people, many of them are heavily reliant on things like dial-a-ride services. And this could greatly improve their individual mobility. But we have a graying population, and you already have news articles, it seems like every week, talking about how we're going to have to yank the elderly population's driver licenses. And I don't think they're going to give them up without a fight. But we also have youth, so you could get kids who need to go to grandma's house. You're busy, you need to go to work, you put them in the car and it takes them there. Things like that, things we've never really, individual mobility that's never been available to many segments of our population. And the things, when you get into some new innovative transportation services, think robo-taxis, and kind of this transportation as a service, these kinds of things, and that could also reduce the need for things like parking infrastructure. If you have roving self-driving taxis all over the place, and people in urban cores may then want to ditch their own cars and rely, basically exclusively on these kinds of services, you perhaps then don't need to build as much parking in the future. Now, on to what we've seen so far in the states on automation-specific legislation. So far, we have Michigan, California, Nevada, Florida, and DC that have passed legislation that explicitly recognizes the legality of self-driving vehicles. I'll get into some of the problems that we've seen with this, but we have a few other examples. Tennessee, I think, is interesting, and this is something more along the lines of what I would like to see, but what Tennessee did this past year is basically preempt localities from passing any sort of ordinance limiting self-driving vehicles, which I think is smart. You don't want to have to go through a patchwork of cities and counties and figure out what's legal where. So I think this should be kicked up to the state level, as most regulation of driver operations and driving are. And then, well, let's just go on to this list. This is just 2015 legislation, and this isn't even all of it. These, I think, are the bills that I selected that are kind of representative of the kind of legislation that we're seeing. But let's go quickly through them. So Georgia, a couple years ago, passed a bill that created a House study committee for these vehicles. In January, that study committee released its report opposing AD-specific laws and regulation at this point, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Connecticut introduced a testing bill that failed. Hawaii introduced an AD operations bill. Georgia Senate has a specification bill that sort of defines some of this technology. Both of those are still pending. Same with this Washington State bill that would exempt automated vehicles from road rules in specific areas. Here on a military base is the big one. And then Idaho has an AV testing bill, also failed. Tennessee, as I mentioned, passed this bill and enacted a law that prohibits local interference with AVs. In Texas, this spring, you had automakers and Google unite in opposition to a bill that was pretty similar to the bill that California enacted back in 2012, and I'll get to that in a moment too. In May, California enacted its existing law on this to amend safe following distance requirements, and this is research that we're currently working on at CEI right now. But this is one of the things we need to be concerned about if we want to get to the platooning stage, because most states unfortunately have very specific safe following distance requirements that effectively would outlaw a lot of these platooning functions by requiring you to stay X number of feet behind a vehicle or X number of seconds behind a vehicle. And then in Arizona, the governor issued an executive order that established the Self-Driving Vehicle Oversight Committee, and that's within the governor's office. But one thing that it did is that it ordered a number of agencies in Arizona to start factoring in automated vehicles into their future planning. We'll see how that goes, because it frankly doesn't provide all that much direction to these agencies.
So is the California platooning, does that put a constraint on what the self-driving cars are actually able to do, or?
That actually, it opens up potential, because before this, you in essence had platooning outlawed. So this way, it was essentially legalized.
Too far apart or something, you know.
It's
allows that variability to understand where you're.
So it defines
based on different rates of speed and so forth.
So what they have is basically, if you look at, like if you were to divide, for instance, regulations in the term of a technical regulation versus a performance standard, what this does is move in the direction of a performance standard, basically saying if you exercise due care and you're meeting, and basically if you're operating safely, which is inherently subjective and law enforcement does it, yeah, instead of having these very specific safe following distance requirements, you allow some of this subjectivity, which could be problematic depending on how it's enforced. But the way the law enforcement is looking at it out there, they're not going to be going after these vehicles if they have reason to believe that they're operating safely. So that's basically, I think that's the direction we should be going, moving away from these very specific
standards. Based on
standards.
speed.
Absolutely.
And other traffic conditions, weather, and all that.
Absolutely, and that's, yeah.
Yeah. Have they made any rules about what's the maximum size of a platoon? Is there an ideal platoon size that is efficient and yet usable?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, if you get into, once you start having any platooning, particularly when you bring freight vehicles, when you bring trucks into this and you allow sort of people to, you know, you have cars behind it able to bank off this, then you're seeing, you know, more fuel efficiency and things like that. I mean, I think having a couple of vehicles would be plenty efficient, but ultimately sort of the vision is that people want to have these maybe dedicated lanes in the future where you can really pack these vehicles in very tightly and move and, you know, and greatly increase throughput on existing infrastructure. Let's see, where am I? Okay, so here's where we are with states actually implementing legislation and regulating. So Nevada is the only place with comprehensive rules in place, and there's certain things to quibble with Nevada here. But ultimately, they were actually able to get this done, which itself I think is pretty instructive. DC's rulemaking is stalled as the statute is now viewed by developers as overly burdensome. Similar thing going on in California. They did roll out testing regulations, but the operations and licensing rules are now 11 months late. And they're likely going to continue being delayed as developers try to find their way around this law. And I'm going to get to the California example more specifically. Now, the Uniform Law Commission launched the State Regulation of Driverless Cars Committee a while back, and there was a lot of concern that there were, you know, so what the ULC does is it comes up with basically model legislation that is then often implemented throughout the country. In these meetings, and then ultimately what was decided this past June is that they were moving too quickly. They were defining technical aspects of these vehicles that, if they must be defined at all, should be defined at the federal level, not the states. So there was a lot of concern, almost unanimous concern over the direction the ULC was going, and thankfully the committee decided to delay any further work for 1 year. So it's going to be at least a year until we start perhaps getting to the drafting stage, but I think a year from now you're going to see these similar objections being raised by the same folks, including us when we commented there. So what has California done? So Google actually was the lobbying force behind this statute in 2012. They largely drafted it, so what it did is that you know, it imposed a number of requirements on the California DMV to implement this. So the DMV rolled out these manufacturer testing regulations in September 2014. These are design specific, and one of the nasty side effects is, you saw a while back Google's full self-driving prototype, that little pod car, that low-speed vehicle. So the engineers at Google were moving way faster than Google's now dismissed government affairs department or team that worked on the 2012 bill. But Google wanted to remove a steering wheel and pedals from the car and basically have a button and have it take you where it was programmed to go. Unfortunately, Google was basically forced to put a removable steering wheel and pedal set back into the vehicle in order to meet the California testing regulations. They are not happy about that. So the draft operations and licensing rules were due in August 2014. And that was the draft. The final rules were due at the end of 2014. We still have yet to see the draft, so we're way, way behind there. So California DMV, and this really isn't the regulator's fault. This is the fault of, I think, well-meaning legislators, but and frankly, well-meaning lobbyists for Google at the time. But you know, they really didn't consider how fast the technology was moving. And what we've ended up here is with a flawed statute, and I think they need to make some substantial revisions if they ever want to start getting these things on the roads, at least on the higher levels of automation, and especially fully automated vehicles. So, like I said, developers, particularly Google, were active 3-4 years ago, going around the country shopping these bills around. And largely they were reactive. You had legislators express interest in doing something on this. We need to act and get out ahead of this. Google's team would then go in and try to shape the bill in a way that was least restrictive. It turns out they didn't do a very good job. But developers have basically done a 180 now. So they're still working with California and DC to try to get these regulations, these operations and licensing rules out that aren't too onerous. But this April, here in Texas, the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers, the big domestic auto lobby here, and Google came down here and they pushed back against this Texas bill that was modeled largely on the California bill. And Google was pretty quiet, although their lobbyists were down here pushing the same line as the Auto Alliance. But what the Auto Alliance said to the press, they said, we don't feel that the legislation in this area in Texas right now is necessary. The concern is by putting pen to paper, you actually could prematurely limit some of those types of developments. Thank you. I just wish they would have been saying this 3 or 4 years ago before we ended up with these 4 or 5 jurisdictions that have some bad laws on the books. Now, I think, honestly, like I said, I think Georgia, what they did is the model. When they released their study committee report at the beginning of this year, they basically said, we don't need these regulations, these laws on the books right now. Let's let developers do their thing, and let's not get in the way. And I think most importantly, and what I really liked about their recommendation, they said, to best promote the development of this technology in Georgia, we must continue on our path to provide a pro-business climate with low taxes and minimal regulation. So do the things the government can do well, if we let them, or if they want to, and that is just provide a good playing field for these guys that will find the state overall attractive for business, including this kind of development. So I think the upshot here is that we should focus on these things that government can do well and not try to get into the nitty-gritty of regulating this nascent technology. The American Legislative Exchange Council has had this resolution, this model resolution, adopted since beginning of 2014. And it urges legislative and regulatory caution, and it basically said a lot of the things that the Georgia House report said earlier this year. I think if legislators feel that they need to do something, this is perhaps the something to take to the State House and push through. It doesn't bind anyone of anything, but it would say the sense of the legislature is that we don't want to get in the way of this exciting and promising technology.
I'm told Alec is evil.
Right, they're evil along with the Koch brothers. Right. But, so yeah, so CEI, and I'm just gonna end here, but CEI, so we're active on this. One thing that we are doing right now is going state by state through the motor vehicle codes, looking at these safe following distance requirements, trying to figure out which states need the most work, need the most updating to move in this sort of performance direction, this sort of, you know, basically, if you're behaving safely, you can operate these things. Again, the concern is that perhaps we put something in law that grants too much discretion to law enforcement, and then you have sort of a Luddite law enforcer that goes out enforcing these things, declaring them to be unsafe. But you know what we've seen across the country, and you have law enforcement groups that are currently working on this issue at the national level through their umbrella organizations. I don't think we're going to see much of that, so I don't think that's much of a concern. But that is the kind of research that needs to be done, is figuring out exactly what's wrong with the existing motor vehicle codes that we can update to sort of pave the way for this technology.
So a couple of questions, I guess, is maybe, you know, the next step is not only you have the, if you will, the intra-vehicle automation, which is kind of addressing here, but then you have the V2V, vehicle-to-vehicle, and vehicle-to-infrastructure type of standards, and then maybe more of the standards and maybe less regulatory. Are y'all taking a position on that?
Right, so
I
we...
think sometimes the V2V looks interesting, the V2I, you know, looks like it would have to be totally standardized, and
Right.
which gets into
So-
more regulatory kind of
Right, so you know,
considerations.
right now NHTSA has begun a rulemaking process. They put out an ANPRM a little while back on V2V. Now, that V2V, that proceeding, does not address automation. They're purely looking at hazard warnings for V2V technology. And in fact, the accompanying technical report that they put out, which is about 360
Even
some...
platooning would need like V2V, right?
Right, exactly. When you get to platooning, you're going to need the V2V or V2I, V2X. But what we're talking about right now, at least as the regulators are looking at this, and this is what was so disappointing, we filed comments pointing this out, in that 360-page technical report that NHTSA put out accompanying their ANPRM, I think the words automation or autonomous or, you know, or similar things appeared twice in that. So that isn't an issue that the federal government is even addressing right now, and that isn't even what the automakers, who are largely behind this V2V mandate push, are looking at. They're looking at it purely from a hazard warning perspective, rather than something that could, you know, coordinate platooning through the. But yes, if you enact a set of standards like this, presumably you could do that in the future. But right now, the federal government, at least at the regulatory level, isn't even really contemplating that, the automation of V2V or V2I.